Hey, welcome. I am Catherine Nolan, once high-performing perfectionist good girl turned goddess of balance, kicking even bigger goals. This is the podcast where we make balance doable for busy, overstretched working women. Embracing your voice, your feminine power and energy allows you to truly step into greatness for the sake of you and all you hold dear. This is balance. The episode you're about to hear is one of my earliest episodes when the podcast was called Don't Be Asked and our focus was on building courage. Since then, you have evolved and so have I. You have fierce courage when it comes to others. And now it's time to balance what you're willing to do for others with what you're willing to do for yourself. Let's go, my friend. Let's bring balance into your life. What blocks courage and who's got the hot goss on letting courage grow? I'm asking, is there a formula to bravery, to getting past the societal barriers and our own self-limiting thoughts? Today you'll meet Megumi. I am completely fangirling about Megumi. I feel like if ever it were possible to be knocked out with a blow from a feather, this is what that would feel like. Her impact, I think, is vast. Megumi has an illustrious career in consulting, strategy and change management. I think though, so not only is she resoundingly qualified to discuss leadership via her career contribution to date, she's also a graceful force, a beautiful example of what it is to be quietly powerful. Lucky for us, it's also the name of her book, a truly wonderful book available at your local or via the link on our show notes. So Megumi's book is called Quietly Powerful: How Your Quiet Nature is Your Hidden Leadership Strength. So today I've been chatting with Megumi because we've been recording a module for my course, for my leadership program, Impact, the Accelerator. And this conversation that I had with her after that recording is what I'm sharing with you now. So I'm going to drop you into the first part of this conversation where where Megumi's telling me what the strengths are that we typically see and typically appreciate or have come to appreciate in leadership. So Megumi's telling me that these leadership traits that we typically see as leader-like are outspoken, fast-paced, directive, and rational. Here's why she says that can be a problem.
And I do think it's shifting, but it's still a little bit biased, and we do need to shift that. And for me, the issue with this bias, if you like, is that it's a human nature that we fall for false expertise where we have these shortcuts. You know, I'm sure you've come across this terminology called unconscious bias. We all have these biases, and we pay attention to people who are louder or pay attention to people who are taller, for that matter, and that's not very helpful. And this has been studied by this Professor Brian Bonner, and it's been studied in a group of people where they did some activities and asked these groups who did they feel were more leader-like, and they pointed to the louder ones, even though the people who are quieter may have had more knowledge and expertise and actually contributed more in different ways. So that actually exists. And unfortunately, this, if you extend it further, this Professor Thomas Chamura-Kremzik would claim that it is one of the reasons why so many incompetent men become leaders. And he talks about how we can get drawn or if you like, fooled by those people who are very confident looking and charismatic, where rather than seeing them as potentially overconfident and self-absorbed, which can be dangerous, we see them as, well, you know, there's a charismatic fellow who's probably leadership material, which is somewhat unhelpful. And he says, and it's wonderfully described in his book, that this results in both business and politics. There's a surplus of incompetent men in charge, and it reduces the opportunities for competent people, both women and men. And in my view, it actually reduces the opportunities for the quietly competent people, women and men, and leaves the standard of leadership depressingly low. So I do believe from a leadership perspective, there is a problem with this bias. And my optimism comes from how, with the pandemic, and I think this world of uncertainty and change has highlighted the strength and the benefit of having leaders who are a bit more thoughtful. And I know people talk about female leaders having been quite impactful in this context of the pandemic and this uncertainty, but I also think it's more about the style of leadership. So this article is a wonderful article talking about the weakness of strong men. And when I read strong men, yes, you can see it as men and women, but actually I do think it's about the strong men's style of leadership. And that strong men's style of leadership is what I would maybe not equate exactly, but sort of relate it to what I talked about in that first column, where it is about being very dominating, outspoken, and so on. And it's not necessarily helpful in the current world that we live in. Quietly powerful leaders exist, is really what I wanted to share. And I've discovered them through these interviews as part of writing my book. And we need this leadership now more than ever, is my view. And the problem, though, is that it's not, we don't see them. And we also have a bit of a stigma, if you like, around being quiet. So if you think about this, let's say you're talking about Megumi and her performance. You know, I'm sure many of you have come across those roundtables when managers talk about people's performance. And so think about that scenario, and you're talking about Megumi. And somebody says, oh, Megumi, she's done some really good work. She's a bit quiet, though. what comes to mind? You know, what do we associate Megumi with then? And I ask this question quite a lot. And what I often get back is these sorts of words. So nervous, lacking confidence, inexperienced, timid, don't have anything to say, shy, reserved, and no knowledge, or even not competent enough, which is really unhelpful, isn't it? Because I may be the most competent person in the world, but just because I'm quieter, people may perceive me to not have the competence even. And so this is the issue, where we certainly don't hear that quiet equals powerful, but we also associate quiet with a lot of sort of weaknesses, if you like, and that's quite unhelpful. Although if you go back to this page, you can see, if you think about it for a while, you can start to notice some of those strengths, like thoughtful, introspective, a good thinker, and a good listener, analytical, and so on. But often the instant image is some of these unhelpful attributes. So quiet is not seen as powerful, and that's what I'm also challenging, that quiet can be powerful. The unfortunate problem is that when we are quiet, we are subject to these sorts of assumptions that people hold, that quiet equals not contributing if we don't say anything in a meeting. And we equate that as not being confident, and we also equate that as being not competent, and we equate that to being not leader-like. And unfortunately, that leads to people like myself being a little bit quieter, being told feedback like this: you need to be more confident, you need to speak up more, you're too quiet, you need to believe in yourself. And by the way, I don't think it's just quiet people that get that. I think women also get this feedback fairly often. And have you noticed how unhelpful this feedback is? And I read this in articles as well quite often, you need to back yourself. And I think to myself, well, that's not helping me, because I know that when I get told you need to be more confident, what's happened to me is I start this big inner dialogue of, oh my God, I'm not very confident. I'm not perceived to be confident. I need to fix something, and I go into a tailspin and actually lose confidence more. So all of this feedback is actually well-meaning, but very unhelpful. And so I tell a lot of managers as part of my presentations that they should stop telling people to be more confident, because it's really unhelpful. And most managers go, I have said that before, I better stop. Because unfortunately, when we continue to get that sort of feedback, we start to feel like there's something wrong with us. And it's really tragic, actually. And there's a psychological term for this, where it's called internalized marginalization. So it's difficult enough being marginalized because maybe you're in the minority. So being an only woman in a male-dominated industry will be one, or a different cultural background, or any other ways of being marginalized. But being quieter, also we can feel like we're marginalized and disempowered. But it's even worse if we start to internalize that in ourselves and start to feel like there's something wrong with us. And that's what can happen and really hold us back and start to have this kind of environment where most people die with their music still locked up inside them, which is a painful quote by Benjamin Disraeli, I think, because we all have this unique music inside us and we don't end up sharing it and nobody hears it, which to me is a real shame. So that's what keeps me going around this whole idea of quietly powerful. And the reason for me personally why I started is, this is me when I was 5. This is me in a kindergarten in Japan. I was actually born in Australia, but I went to Japan a number of times. And as a 5-year-old living in Japan with Japanese parents, and generally speaking, Japanese people are seen as a bit quieter and reserved and polite, but even amongst them, I was quiet. So I was seen as a very quiet child, but I never really thought much of it because my mum used to talk on my behalf, and I thought it was easy, so I just let her talk. So that's how I grew up. And as I went to school as well, I actually moved around a lot of countries and schools. So I went to 8 different schools in 3 different countries. And I had to stay quiet sometimes to just fit in and stay under the radar so I don't get picked on. And I still got picked on, especially in Australia, because I look different. But, it was my survival mechanism. And then in Japan, the other thing that happened was this whole conditioning of you must blend in. So this is me in high school in my class. And I bet you can't guess where I am. It's very difficult to work out. All the girls look fairly similar. We all had to have very similar haircuts, interestingly. And so the idea in schools in Japan is that you have to blend in and fit. So this is another thing that occurred, and you got told off for not fitting in. So by the way, this is me there. And so then as I went into the workplace and I started working in Australia as a management consultant, it was really difficult because I had to look confident going into clients who were much more senior and older and often male-dominated industries. And I had to go in with this knowledge, which some of it was useful, but the clients knew a lot more in some cases. And I had to go in looking confident, and it was exhausting. So it took me a while to get used to that, but I did actually exhaust myself. And one time I moved into this sort of leadership and organizational culture field, and I started to do all this group work and presenting, and I started to get better at it as I learned the skills. But there was one time I was co-facilitating with a colleague who was the opposite end of me. And so he was the most gregarious, entertaining person ever who would have people laughing within the first 2 minutes. And when I work with him, I was sitting and he started off the workshop, and I started to think, oh my God, my colleague's starting to get the group to laugh, and he's so entertaining and he's engaging. And I started to compare myself. Do you ever have those? I don't know, but I have this little voice that starts to go, oh my God, I'm so boring compared to him. I'm going to disengage the group. I'm going to stuff this all up, even though he created this wonderful energy. So I started to have all these voices. And then my turn came up, and I've been facilitating for a long time, so I did fine. And the workshop went along okay. But during the break, I had a colleague who came up to me and said, Megumi, what's going on? You're not quite yourself today. And I said, oh, I've just been sitting there watching my colleague, and I felt like I wasn't going to do as good a job. And I started to having these little voices in my head and, doubting myself. And she looked me in the eye and said to me at this moment, she said, Megumi, the fact that the two of you are so different is what makes it valuable. So if you keep comparing yourself and make yourself less than, you're not bringing your best. So just get out of that and, just be your best, not like him, not be like him. And that was a moment where I intellectually knew that I needed to be myself and bring my authentic self. But that was a moment where it really hit me. And I started to think I really need to work on that. And that was the beginning of the thought process around Quietly Powerful, to really start to own my quieter nature and start to work with it. And so you can see through this story of mine that there's actually not, there's quite a few reasons why people can be quiet. So of course there's personality, but even amongst personality, it's not just introversion, extroversion. There's also other factors like people who get more anxious more easily. So there's a personality trait, some will call it neuroticism, but I like to call it emotionality, where people get more anxious more easily, or people get more excited more easily. And those people, even if you're an extrovert, you can get really anxious and go quiet. So I've known lots of people like that, and they've come to my programs. So that's really interesting. And I also mentioned to you about the conditioning, how you're brought up. Did you get brought up as, children should be quiet and be seen, not heard? Or did you get brought up being told never to argue with authority, whether it's teachers or parents or elders? Did you get told to be respectful and not interrupt? That causes us to go quieter too. So there's a lot of conditioning that can be a part. And as you know, with my Japanese background, there's a lot of conditioning there too. And then there's also power dynamics. And what I mean by that is, are you in the mainstream or are you in the minority? So if you are the only woman in a group of men, it is harder to speak up. If you're the one person who has an idea that's different to everybody else, it's harder to speak up. So you may go a little bit quieter. So it's really too simplistic to say it's about introversion, extroversion, which is really what I wanted to highlight. And so what I'm talking about is the difference between quiet and quietly powerful, because there is a big difference. And what I invite people to do, if they are quiet, is to find a way to become quietly powerful. When you're quietly disempowered, so you're just simply quiet out of anxiety or fear, it's because we may be lacking awareness of the impact we may have. So some of us, and I know I've done this too, I may have a blank face, it's a Japanese face, of course, and I may stay quiet and people misunderstand me and think that I'm disengaged or not interested. So it was my lack of awareness. And I've been given that feedback and I started to work on looking more engaged. And so I use my facial expressions more than I used to. I use my eyebrows more. Apparently Japanese people don't have very developed eyebrow muscles or muscles around the eyebrows. So anyway, so I've started to work on them. And so I use my eyebrows, as you can see. And the other aspect of being quietly disempowered is that we start to blame and make excuses. So we might say, oh, well, they won't listen anyway. Or we might say, well, this is who I am. I'm just a quiet person, so don't expect me to speak up. And that's not helpful either, because that can be disempowering. And of course, I mentioned already the fear and anxiety. We get nervous about what other people may think when we speak up. We worry about looking stupid for asking a question. All these things can start to cause us to feel quietly disempowered. And then the final piece is about underestimating ourselves, and partially to do with that internalized marginalization, that we're no good, we're not as good as others. And so we go quiet thinking, oh, I don't have anything useful to say. And so that's disempowering as well. Even if you have all the competence, you may hold back from saying it because of these little voices in our heads. And so the work of going from feeling quietly disempowered to quietly powerful is really what I wanted to share as part of and learn as part of my interviews with quietly powerful leaders. Because when you speak to these quietly powerful leaders, they are incredibly effective. And the thing is, when I speak to people who've worked for these leaders, they say they are the best leaders they've worked for. So what's that about when we say, but in terms of how you can grow more and more like these quietly powerful leaders, especially if you have a quieter nature, but also even if you don't, are two things. And this is what I do with my clients, my coaching and programs, where I help them to appreciate themselves more fully. And this leads into being more comfortable with yourself and allows you to be more present. So appreciating fully is actually about, as it says, appreciate yourself fully, not partially. One thing I noticed with things like strengths-based coaching is that there is a risk of focusing too much on the strengths and like feeling bad about having these weaknesses. And so that's not necessarily, the play to your strengths. I agree to an extent, but then that doesn't always help you to appreciate yourself fully. And so what I work with people is actually look at everything, to look at, what are your natural tendencies? What are your strengths? And what do you perceive as your weaknesses? And really reframe so you can shift the story you tell yourself about yourself. Yeah, I agree. So that's why I really am happy when organizations invite me to come and speak to them, and sometimes they ask me to come and speak to them, to their senior leaders, and that's my favorite part, to say, well, you've got to recognize some of these overlooked hidden talent that you have in your organizations. I think one of the skills that all leaders, but particularly the not so quiet leaders, can develop is observation skills. And that might actually require them to become a little quieter to be able to notice and observe what's going on in a team. And I actually think that's a really crucial skill for any leader anyway, because if you're not noticing what's going on in a team and really getting to know the team better in a deeper way, then how are you supposed to get the best out of them? So when those leaders, particularly if you are not so quiet, then it might require you to be a little bit quieter, more observant, and speak with people and give them more space so they can share, ask better questions so they can share. Then you get to know their strengths a lot more rather than making assumptions. So I think the second piece will be stop making assumptions. You don't know people until you really, really try to understand them. That's where stereotypes comes from, isn't it? Like somebody doesn't speak very much in a meeting, we make assumptions, we make up stories about them, saying, oh, they're not very confident, they don't know they don't know anything, they don't say anything. So those assumptions are very, very dangerous. So I would question the whole process first of all. I think too many. Sorry?
I was hoping you'd say that.
Yeah. It's like we work off first impressions, and that's not always helpful, because some people just they have a different kind of first impression, but they may have an amazing second impression if you actually get to know them. And in fact, one of the quietly powerful leaders that I spoke to talked about that and saying she makes a terrible first impression because she's so small in stature, she's very quietly spoken, and she's a woman in a male-dominated industry. So she makes a terrible impression. In fact, she's invisible. And so she has to work really hard to make a really good second impression for her to be included in the conversation. And she has done so very successfully and has been a partner at a professional services firm. So it can be done, but it takes a bit of effort from the individual. So if you flip it to the other side, especially if you're looking for people in an organization, appointing people, I think the process is flawed, because you're making judgments based on first impressions only. And I cringe a bit when people talk about making an appointment, saying, oh, well, that person interviewed well. Do you want people in roles who interview well, or do you want people who do the job well?
Yeah.
So I just think that there's something not quite right about the process. So if there was a better process, it might be more about getting them to do the job and see how they do it. I would have thought, but anyway, but time is a bit limited. So if you still have to go with the process, what I would suggest is if you can get better at I think it's back to the same question of the previous one, of getting better at observing, getting better at asking questions to inquire more. So if somebody's really hesitant about, sharing their achievements, make sure that you read their resume and ask them about, well, what did you do there? And what was your contribution there? So you bring them out rather than them having to feel like they're bragging. Well, that would be my suggestion.
I believe that women do help other women. I hope that this episode has empowered you to question your willingness to go last. I hope that you will embrace balance, and I'm also hoping that you will help me to help other women to do the same. So how can you help? Show your support for the work. Subscribe and review the podcast here where you're listening. Follow the Goddess of Balance on Instagram to catch some cheeky behind the scenes and extras. Connect with me on LinkedIn and share the posts with your network. That would be sensational. If you have enjoyed this program, this episode, you will no doubt love my group coaching program. You got to find all the links to these in their little written blurb for this episode. Thank you, my friend, for normalizing balance with me. We are raising performance and reputations, wellness and equality. Together, we're creating positive change for working women, starting with you. Sincerely, I thank you for being part of the movement.